Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome back to my channel. Today, as with always, I am looking back at the Booker Prize and particularly some of the older shortlists. Now, as I go through these Booker Prize shortlists, there are occasionally ones that I absolutely adore and occasionally ones that I don't necessarily, it's fair to say. And 2014 was a bit of a weird shortlist for me. Again, I'm not sure if it's that I was just tired when I was reading most of them, when I got most of them out of the library. We were just about to go into lockdown when I was finishing them. So maybe that had a slight impact as sort of tension started ramping up around it. But I also just think it was a bit of a weird year and I'd like to talk about it a little bit. 2014 was the first year that American authors were allowed to to be nominated for the Booker Prize. And for many people, that was an incredibly controversial decision. I don't really mind too much. As much as it does occasionally mean that perhaps authors from other countries and particularly authors with smaller spotlights on their writing might not necessarily always break through. You know, the prize has traditionally been very dominated by British writers, which to some degree makes sense as it is a prize that sort of originates in Britain. But at the same time, I think it does have to be said that, you know, when you've got potential for Canadian and Indian authors and authors from so many other places that have such rich and diverse writing kind of histories and cultures, it does sometimes seem quite strange that it gets dominated by certain places. And so there was a lot of fear when the Americans landed into the prize that it would start causing issues in that sense as well. And what's interesting actually about when people spoke about that is we often do just talk about 2014 being the year that Americans were allowed to join it. And that's mostly because they were seen as, you know, one of the biggest groups who had been excluded from the prize in previous years, not being part of the Commonwealth, and also that they are obviously such a big and dominant country when it comes to international publishing, and so therefore it was felt, and particularly in English, and so therefore it was felt that they would unfairly dominate the prize or take too much space from other authors. But it is actually worth noticing that Americans being allowed to join was part of a much bigger movement to take it away from just being Commonwealth countries. So now any book written in English, originally written in English, can be eligible for the prize, so long as it is published in the UK. So that actually does open it up for many other countries, such as Ethiopia, as we see in 2020, although the writer was also American, and many other kind of countries that have sort of traditionally not been involved in that many book prizes internationally. So with that said, this was the first year that the Americans were there, and so there was a lot of speculation about what would happen, about whether it would suddenly be dominated by American writers, and particularly whether the whole shortlist would be American, or whether we'd see a string in a row of just American winners. And actually, you know, it took a good couple of years after Americans were allowed to join for there to be the first American winner. 2014 was their first eligible year, and 2016 was the first time we saw an American winner with Paul Beatty. But 2014, we see the first two American authors on the shortlist, and that's what I'm going to be talking about a little bit today. The first book I'm going to be talking about today is the winner of the 2014 Booker Prize, Richard Flanagan, and his novel, The Narrow Road to the Deep North. This is a novel all about prisoners of war in a Japanese camp. It's incredibly graphic and brutal in parts, but also just so poignant and beautiful. It reminds me a lot of Sebastian Barry, probably also because I read them at kind of a similar time. But their ability to marry together a very, very accessible writing style, a very detailed look at war, but also with this beautiful, rich, poetic style. So I absolutely love this novel. I sort of raced through it. I found it incredibly moving. There's a whole passage about this idea of a circle being kind of painted. It really goes into this brutality of Japanese prisoners of war, prisoner of war camps against Australians, but with a kind of acknowledgement that there was also a lot of violence happening from many other sides during the conflict. And I think what's so powerful about this as well is there is actually a sort of personal connection for Richard Flanagan. He has family members who were in prisoner of war camps. And so part of this for him was not only a process of writing the novel and kind of doing the research, but part of that research was also kind of connecting with family stories about prisoner of war camps, which I can imagine must have been both incredibly rewarding for him in terms of finding out more about his family, but also deeply traumatic to kind of process that has happened to people he knows. And I think in some ways that personal element to it really shines through in the writing. There's a real urgency to the writing and a real power in talking about these, in telling these stories. He really goes into detail about the horrible causes of, the horrible effects that the prisoner of war camp had on so many people. So for example, them losing weight, growing incredibly sick, fighting or trying to fight back against sort of this brutality, but being just too weak and too worn out by everything to be able to contend with it, and that sheer futility all the way through. But what's really beautiful, I think, and I mentioned this sort of circle that's painted, the circle that is painted is part of a brushstroke poem that they refer to, a Japanese poem that is just sort of done with one brushstroke. And even in the book, it's sort of shown in brushstroke. You know, you kind of see the little edges of it. And I thought that was a really beautiful way to contrast that poetry and this sort of quiet reflection and of sort of literature with this brutality of the real world, which is obviously then also mirrored in the book, that we're talking about real life events, but we're hearing them through such beautiful prose. And I am not surprised in that sense at all that Richard Flanagan was the winner from this. For me, this was one of my favorite books of the lot, and I totally see why this was the winner. As I sort of mentioned, the 2014 shortlist was not my favorite. There are a few books that I absolutely love from this book and from this list, and a few that I did enjoy. But for me, Richard Flanagan straight away makes complete sense as the winner in this list. Apparently, my cat wants to join for this next this next one. So the next is Joshua Ferris with "To Rise Again at a Decent Hour." Now, this was the first American, one of the two Americans in this shortlist, as I mentioned, and this is a story all about how my life got to, this is a story all about a dentist who starts believing that his identity has been stolen. So suddenly there is this Facebook account created, and he starts feeling like his identity is being stripped away from him. And it is quite a clever novel in that, although it seems to follow some kind of typical tropes about, you know, technology and stolen identity and wondering who you really are, it still manages to feel fairly fresh and new, which is always a tricky thing, I think, particularly when you talk about technology. I have a personal bugbear sometimes of when technology is referenced in certain books, because I think if it's not done well enough, it can feel so dated so quickly. I'm sort of thinking of examples of where people, you know, like, even when you hear old songs where they talk about paging people and you're like, ooh, you know, do you work in a hospital? Because that's pretty much the only time people use paging now. And that's the thing with technology. These things can get incredibly dated incredibly quickly. And so I always appreciate when writers are very quick to kind of establish the role of technology in that book, and manage to make it not feel kind of hackneyed and old-fashioned and weird. There was I can't remember where I read this from, but there was something before about how, for a writer, if you've got technology in a book, you know, a modern challenge for technology is that you have to get rid of it as soon as you can within a narrative. The reason for that being that I think that the article I read or podcast I listened to about it references something like Romeo and Juliet. So actually, if Romeo and Juliet happened now, that whole scene with the kind of mistaken death, like, you know, is Juliet really asleep or is she dead? That wouldn't necessarily happen now, as she could just, you know, it would just be a text of like, meet me here, you know, whereas a letter can obviously get waylaid, and that's something that it's a bit harder to suspend disbelief around technology in that sense, because it's fair to assume that all characters in books unless stated, would have those technology pieces. I think this is where, for example, an author like Ali Smith is fantastic, because she really weaves in technology into what the characters are doing, but it's not a central focus. So yes, a character could text to say that they're running late or whatever, and that would affect the narrative, but she's normally quite clever at finding ways that technology supports rather than takes away from that narrative. The same I would say for The Hate You Give by, I want to say, Angie Thomas. There's a technology in that book is really cleverly used, I think, because it furthers this idea of kind of disagreements about racism and about people's insensitivity to racism and not wanting to hear about it being part of their personal life. So actually someone wants to switch off from this thing and gets annoyed that someone posts about racist violence on Tumblr. And I think that's really clever. I think Joshua Ferris is actually also does quite well with this, in the sense that it's almost that in reverse. It's a character who intentionally does not use technology, and it's the more he falls into using technology that the narrative is able to unfold, right? So it's only because his identity has been stolen, you know, there's a fake Facebook profile created for him, but he doesn't have Facebook. So he actually slowly starts going into technology and being part of it. And that's kind of where his problems lie, but also the only way that he can solve this problem. It is essentially, I think, quite a clever way of inverting that whole trope of having to go into the belly of the beast to solve the problem. That's exactly what he's doing. He's having to grapple with technology to solve his problems with technology to then come out the other side. All the while, it's quite a funny book about this dentist. I think when you kind of read the sort of plot summary at first, you're like, okay, it's a dentist who has his identity stolen. That does not make for a very in-depth or exciting or new narrative to me. However, I think it's actually done really well. The only thing I will say is, I think, as with a lot of the 2014 list for me, I enjoyed reading them, but I wasn't necessarily blown away. And I think sometimes, you know, a fantastic thing about prizes is obviously that it exposes you to new authors you wouldn't have tried out. And I have to say, at least 2 or 3 of this list of the novels that I absolutely adored, I wouldn't have known about unless it was for the prize. And so I'm incredibly grateful. And obviously I'm not expecting to love every single book on this shortlist. It's not 2005 shortlist where I loved every single one. Not every shortlist is going to be something that I absolutely adore. And that's exactly the point. There will be hopefully something for everyone. But what really surprised me was the number of very readable books in 2014's list. And I don't mean that to say that the Booker Prize has to be full of these turgid, inaccessible, giant tomes of really dense, difficult literature. Not at all. But there is often something to be said about when a writer can marry together both really in-depth ideas and, you know, take the reader to some place new that they would never have considered, you know, really expand their mind, challenge them in terms of their ideas, challenge them with exciting writing, and create, you know, a plot and narrative that's easy to follow. And, you know, that's asking a lot. But I think what I found with the 2014 list personally is that it's a list that I enjoyed reading, but it was only a few of them just kind of felt like quite easy, nice reads that I was glad I read, but I don't necessarily know if I'm thinking about them too much after that. But that said, Joshua Ferris's book I thought was really great. I think it was a nice, fun addition to this list. And there was clearly a bit more of a lean towards humour and readability, I think, in this shortlist personally, as I'll come on to a bit with Howard Jacobson, who's sort of known for some of his humour, and the next book that I'm about to talk about. So the next novel on this list, and the next American, is Karen Joy Fowler's We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves. Sorry, I always get her name wrong and I have no idea why. Yeah, We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves. And this novel is all about two parents who are psychologists and sort of behavioral psychologists and sort of scientists and researchers in various ways. And they bring up their daughter alongside a chimpanzee. And it's basically to kind of partly see how they kind of react to each other, how they get on, and whether indeed they will show similarities. And I think this is actually where the title of this novel is quite clever. We are all completely beside ourselves. Obviously, it has that idea of, you know, beside ourselves with joy, beside ourselves with anguish, but also literally being beside yourself in the idea of our closest kind of genetic cousins with these sort of primates. However, for me, I mean, I enjoyed the novel. I thought it was really good. What really surprised me, though, was a lot of people spoke about how there was a great twist or a really like surprising and shocking moment in the novel. And for me, I don't know, I kind of saw that coming. I don't know if that sounds really arrogant or big-headed or what have you. But for me, basically, kind of towards the end, I don't want to spoil it, just in case it wasn't as obvious or whatever. But or maybe I was just really slow and missed a massive implication on that. That is also very likely, especially as I was finishing this novel, sat in the library about to try and give it back. So it was just sort of sat there finishing the last 50 pages rapidly. But, you know, essentially, as this child grows older and comes to learn a little bit more about the primate sort of sibling, essentially, there's, you know, it's really heartbreaking. You've got this sort of whole image of essentially these two sisters as they see each other being separated because suddenly the primate is seen as being dangerous. You know, there was a moment of the primate being seen to be violent and it being perceived that as a result the primate had to be put down or had to be kind of isolated from humans because it was clearly a risk to people. And how can you justify bringing up your child alongside something that might harm them? You know, like same way sort of argued as if, you know, you had a dangerous dog, for example. So it's really interesting in how it goes into that, and particularly the idea of comparing, you know, what is humanity? What is it to be human? If a primate can do a lot of these things and can have some of these similar connections, where is the line drawn for what a human is and what a primate or chimpanzee or whatever is? And so that's a really clever part of the narrative, I think. And it's a really, really easy read. I thought it kind of, it floats along quite nicely. There are some obviously really harsh and tricky scenes, and it's clear that that Fowler has done a lot of research into this as well. There's a sort of set of acknowledgements towards the end where she talks about the research that has gone into the book, and clearly she has spent a lot of time getting ready for this, and I think it's a great achievement. I was just quite surprised personally to see it on a booker list, and I realize that sounds incredibly snobbish. I think maybe part of my reason behind that feeling, and probably unfairly, is that it was a novel that then sold very, very well. And so I knew of it as kind of a bestseller before I knew of it as a Booker shortlisted novel. And I don't know which came first. I don't know whether it basically, like we're seeing with Shuggie Bain now, like Shuggie Bain is now selling incredibly well. Bernardine Evaristo's Girl, Woman, Other is now selling really well. And both of them kind of got there in some ways because of the Booker Prize. Like the Booker Prize boosted the profile of those two wonderful books, and gave it a lot of, gave them probably additional sales and additional attention that they might not otherwise have had. And so part of me does wonder if this is why I know of it so much as kind of a bestseller, whether it kind of gained a lot of traction because, you know, not only being big in the US, but being on the Booker shortlist. Still, you know, I think it's a great novel. I think it's very well done. Just for me, I don't know, I finished the novel and didn't really find myself thinking about it too much afterwards. Again, perhaps I'm being unfair on it, but yeah, I think it's still a worthwhile addition to the 2014, that's the year we're on, the 2014 shortlist, and I think it's well worth a read if that sounds like something that would interest you. Next up is a very different novel, is Howard Jacobson with J. Now this novel came 4 years after he won the prize in 2010 with The Finkler Question. And a lot of Howard Jacobson's writing is kind of concerned with Jewish identity and with Jewish identity in various forms kind of related to the countries it's in. So the idea of The Finkler Question speaks a lot about Judaism in the UK and Jewish identity within that, and whether British Jews sort of see themselves as British and Jewish, or where they see their Jewish identity and where they feel that they're kind of very connected to a long history of Judaism and Jewish identity, and where they feel disconnected from it. And J is very similar in some senses, in that it focuses on this idea of something terrible has happened to this village. It's almost, or to the kind of town. It's very dystopian in some ways. And we know that something's happened and there is some group that is demonized and another group that's prioritized over them. And we're not quite sure for quite a while, but it's heavily hinted that there's been some kind of event. I mean, it's kind of always capitalized about what has happened, and nobody feels able to talk about it. And so this carries on throughout the novel, where we have this strong sense of something we cannot talk about and that cannot be in any way discussed. And as this goes on, as the plot kind of deepens, we kind of get more and more of a sense of what has happened, that this minoritized group has been heavily persecuted, but again, nobody wants to speak about the crimes. And there are obviously kind of parallels there with things like the Holocaust and things like other kind of giant tragedies and eras of persecution that people do not want to talk about on either side. People who have been persecuted feel almost that it's so overwhelming that we can't talk about it, or are so ashamed by what's happened. And equally, people who have done the persecuting, or at least turned a blind eye to it, or are part of the group of society that wasn't persecuted, feel a sense of guilt, partly survivor's guilt, partly guilt for not having done anything. And that really impacts on how they go through the novel. And I think that's incredibly powerful throughout J. I didn't necessarily always love the novel. I actually found parts of the writing a bit difficult. And I realize I've been saying that after saying about how some of these other novels are so easy to read, and that almost makes them feel less literary or whatever. And so it does seem a bit hypocritical in some ways to sort of talk about how I found Howard Jacobson's writing quite dense. But at times it was, but I think actually there was a really great payoff towards the end of the novel. I personally found the ending quite affecting in many ways. I think Howard Jacobson is a writer who, from what I can see from reviews of various books of his, does tend to divide people. The Finkler Question is one of the, at least talking on about Goodreads reviews, is one of the poorest reviewed Booker winners ever, which I actually think is unfair. Like, don't get me wrong, I don't think it's necessarily the strongest Booker winner we've ever had, but I still think it's a great book in many ways. I think he's got a very interesting writing style that for many people is quite divisive, because he's very sarcastic in places, very heavy in some other parts, and I think you've kind of got to stick with him for a little bit to kind of get where he's going. I don't think it's always that immediate. And I've listened to a couple of interviews with him, and the more I've listened to him in interview form, the more I kind of get the novels and why some people have issues with them, because he's a very funny man, but he's got a very specific type of humor. And I think in book form, you sometimes have to give that a long time to lead up to where those jokes come in. So in the Finkler Question, the first 50 pages, I just thought, I can't do this. And actually about 150 pages in, I was loving it. I thought this was really clever and really funny. It's that very British, sarcastic, sardonic humor. It's the little asides, it's little comments here and there. And he kind of, as a result, requires you to do a lot of the work yourself. You have to pay a lot of attention, you know, in his book and in his writing. And I think that's kind of partly because of the dense nature of it, because they're so packed with sort of jokes and comments and commentaries, but also the nuances of the topics he's talking about are really detailed and fractious. So, you know, talking about something like survivor's guilt around a Holocaust sort of situation is obviously a really difficult topic, and so I think it's quite bold to kind of go out and create this very tightly structured book that kind of talks about that, and it's difficult to, that's not, you know, you can't kind of address something like that in 2 or 3 pages. You need a novel length to almost pull out some of those intricacies. And that's the same thing I found with the Finkler Question. That needed to be novel length, because you've got in that a character who is not Jewish but wants to be and feels that he should be, because of various traits. You've got Jewish characters who don't identify with their Jewishness or Jewish culture or British Jewish culture, And then you've got that tension between the two of them, of one claiming to be more Jewish than the other based on something else, one by birth, one by actions. And I think what's really clever about the Finkler question, and in some ways about Jay, is how Howard Jacobson pulls out those contradictions and those difficulties, and really gets that conversation going. So I get it. I think I get it now. But I read Jay first and was a bit like, who is this guy? What is happening here? And eventually kind of got there later in the novel, and then listened to some interviews by him, then read the Finkler question. So I think he's an author you do have to sort of stick with a little bit. Jay wasn't my favorite novel on the shortlist, but I do think it definitely deserved a place there. For me, there's a lot that's going on in it that I thought was very clever and really pulls at some of the discussions that I think a lot of authors would not necessarily go into. And it's really exciting to have that kind of, you know, I don't know much about the British Jewish experience or the British Jewish voice. And so it's really interesting for me to learn a little bit more from him on that. Next up, we have Neel Mukherjee's The Lives of Others. So this concerns a multi sort of generational family saga in India. And what I really love about a lot of Indian writing I've read, and this is not to lump it all together, obviously Indian writing is incredibly diverse, but of the Indian novels I've read, what I always really love, and sometimes struggle with, in fairness, but ultimately really love, is the really complex inter-family relationships that go on. So you've got, you know, multiple kind of aunties and uncles and cousins and second cousins introduced. You've normally got at least 3 or 4 generations of characters introduced, and they all have sort of a various role to play in each other's lives, which I think is really fun and really engaging, and particularly in a novel like The Lives of Others, was done really humorously and warmly and cleverly. So you've got these characters who have, it's kind of wonderful. There's always this kind of bickering in this novel of kind of characters with various expectations on other characters, people lying, cheating, stealing, being lazy or working really hard, and this real kind of tension. And I think I often really enjoy novels about families. I love a good complicated family novel because I think there's so much richness to be drawn from the little kind of complications between family members. You know, a mother's expectations of her child going unfulfilled, but meanwhile the child feeling angry at various kind of aspects of what they've been bound to by their family. And I think this novel does it incredibly cleverly. It's quite a long novel. It's kind of close to about 500 pages. And I just loved it. I also have to admit, I listened to this as an audiobook. So of this, I think, yeah, of this shortlist, that's the only one I listened to instead of read. I kind of read half of it and listened to the other half on audiobook, and a good 2 or 3 hours of it on audiobook while I was going on a long run, which was really great to lose myself in this giant family saga. I really enjoyed it. It concerns a character who basically starts, well, many layers of this, but there is one character who is a sort of early maths genius and goes on to solve various things, and the kind of family expectations and pressures on that, whilst dealing with poverty. So the characters not necessarily being able to afford school to do the various things that they need to, or to kind of get to where they need to. All these kind of inter-family dramas about who stole this, who pawned this. It's so rich and so funny, and I think Neel Mukherjee has done something incredible here. I have to admit, like, I didn't know anything about this novel. I hadn't really heard about it until I read it for the shortlist, and then I just absolutely loved the kind of ingenuity of it all. It's so in-depth. I felt like I really knew those characters, even though there were so many of them, and ultimately it reaches a really satisfying ending. There's something I love when a novel can be that sprawling and dense and yet somehow reach a really just really race towards this ending where everything starts getting wrapped up. I don't know how an author plots that. Honestly, I cannot imagine for the life of me how you tie together all these little threads at the end and make it satisfying and make it readable. But yeah, I think Neel Mukherjee did a fantastic job with this novel. And so for me, I would you know, of the six, I would say maybe Richard Flanagan's Narrow Road to the Deep North and Neel Mukherjee's The Lives of Others are probably the two I would have as my personal favourites to win. So I'm very glad that they were both in it. And I just think it's a novel that's well worth checking out and well worth sticking with, because I know it can be difficult to stick with something that long and that sprawling and complex, but it's well worth it. It also starts with an incredibly brutal scene that completely threw me. And I think is well worth going into. There's a very weird thing about listening to it as an audiobook as well, because there are lots of mathematical symbols and equations mentioned and used in it. And so at one point when I was running, kind of doing this sort of long run and listening, there was, you know, somewhat like I was sort of listening to a good sort of 5 minutes of someone talking about a maths sort of problem, which I know that had it been on a physical page, I probably would have just turned over, because as much as you want to kind of read every word on a page when you're reading a novel, I think it's sometimes safe to skip a mathematical equation. I don't know if you're necessarily going to get that much more literary value from it, but it's very weird running and hearing this novel and hearing someone kind of say, you know, like X plus Y minus, and you're like, what is, I can't keep this in my head. But yeah, absolutely beautiful novel, and a really great addition to this list. Last but not least, a novel from a writer I absolutely adore. It's Ali Smith with How to Be Both. So this novel I think is interesting in many, many ways. Firstly, the way it was published. So Ali Smith, because basically the novel concerns two stories that are meant to be kind of, that run alongside each other. So one is way further back in the past and concerns a painter who is trying to establish herself, but to do so has to kind of pretend to be male, kind of, and disguise herself while painting something. And the other side of the story is a teenage girl whose mother is obsessed with the work of this artist, and it's kind of about her development and her growth, and particularly her kind of the awakening of her identity, and particularly her sexual identity, as she sort of starts sort of falling in love or fancying people for the first time and trying to find her feet. And that's in some ways textbook Ali Smith, and I don't mean that as an insult in the slightest. She's great at writing teenage characters. I think probably one of the best I've seen. Writing teenagers can be really hard, because I've seen so many people make teenagers completely one-dimensional, completely boring, and they often read as sort of placeholders for rants about technology. So like, oh, and they spent all day on their phone. Oh, what is the world coming to? And you're like, wow, you have clearly never been a teenager, and you clearly don't understand what would be part of that. You know, even pre-technology, teenagers are written about very weirdly, and it's because there's a, you know, that disjunct in values and in understanding, and people often not being able to look back at who they were as teenagers, well, when they're adults. You know, it's kind of hard to sympathize. I've definitely done this before, where people I used to work with who were teenagers, when I was older, I was sort of line managing them, and I had to step back at one point and be like, Bob, at 19, you would have done the same. Like, their decision does not make sense to you, but that's because at the time I was 30 or like 29 or 30. Of course it doesn't make sense to you. You're not that age anymore. At 19, I would have done the same, most likely. And I think Ali Smith is probably, yeah, as I was saying, the best writer that I know of to write about, in terms of writing about teenagers, particularly their awakening, sort of intellectually, sexually, romantically, all of those kinds of things. I think she understands that and always gives them a fun voice, and even making it feel very current. So at one point there's a character that this teenage girl is watching hardcore porn on an iPad, and the way Ali Smith writes about the way that a teenager, a particularly younger teenager, would be both completely repulsed and terrified by that, but also drawn to it in a way that they can't quite explain, and also understanding that that both needs to be incredibly private with some people, but also something maybe quite public in terms of talking to friends about it. So I think she does that incredibly well. Anyway, going off topic here, How to Be Both then has these two stories, and Ali Smith, in the publication of it, said basically that you could read either story first. It didn't matter about the order. And in fact, when the book was published, half of the copies were published with you know, the older year first, and then the current time next, and then the other half of the books were published the other way around. So you started with the modern day, and then you went back in time. It's particularly because those two periods of time are meant to cross over and have parallels. And I thought that was genius. And again, something that only Ali Smith can really pull off. I can imagine so many other authors who I really respect and love trying to do that and it not working. Ali Smith has that kind of quirkiness and joy and playfulness and experimentation that I think makes that work. I don't think anyone else can make that happen. So when Ali Smith does it, it works, and we get How to Be Both, which again is a clever play on words. A lot of the titles in this shortlist were very good, actually, I think. But the idea of how to be both, not only in terms of sexuality, in terms of bisexuality, how to be both in terms of what it means to be kind of good or bad, modern or ancient, the two timelines, kind of what it means to be male or female, all of these kind of conflicts and tensions that are natural and these kind of dichotomies that we have and discuss. So not only is that all great, and I love that, but I think it's just so playful and fun and interesting. It's not my favorite Ali Smith book. They're like The Accidental, for example, back in 2005, I adored. It's probably one of my favorites of hers, and I'm sort of working my way through the seasonal quartet. But I just think it's Ali Smith. You're going to enjoy it. If you love Ali Smith, I think pretty much all of her writing is so open to you as something you'll enjoy. This book also went on to win the Women's Prize. Although it didn't win the Booker, it had a very good year and was a worthy winner of the Women's Prize as well. But that brings us to all of those 6 books together for the shortlist. And it's a very strange list. Again, I know I've said this many, many times with different lists, because obviously books being published in the same year won't always be that similar or have that many crossovers. But, you know, you've got a prisoner of war story next to something like How to Be Both, next to a sprawling Indian family saga in The Lives of Others. And you've got like this comical dentist novel, a novel about a chimp raised alongside humans. And the other novel that I have forgotten to mention in this. But overall, I think it's just such a stunning, there's some absolutely stunning, oh, Jay, there we go. Howard Jacobson being the other book, a book kind of about a Holocaust-esque situation. And so although the shortlist overall isn't my favorite, I think there are definitely some stronger shortlists for me personally. I also think this is still a really good place to go. It's still worth checking out all of these books if they interest you. For me, yeah, like I was saying, I would, if it wasn't Richard Flanagan who won, and I think he was the right winner for this, The Lives of Others or How to Be Both, I think are both very, very worthy winners. I think the other 3 novels are definitely, yeah, worth checking out. But for me, don't necessarily hit the mark in the way that I want. But that's always going to happen, you know, over the Booker Prizes 50 odd years, we've had, you know, probably close to about 300 novels now that have been shortlisted for it, and many, many others that have been longlisted. Not all of those books are going to appeal to everybody, especially not to me. So it's still worth checking out. And yes, I would love to know your thoughts. Have you read any of the 2014 shortlist? If so, what were your thoughts? Who would be your winner? Were there any other books that didn't make the shortlist or that weren't put forward, perhaps, that you think would have been even better or that should have been part of that shortlist? Please do let me know. Once again, I've been Bob the Bookerer, and thank you for listening and thank you for watching. Take care and enjoy your reading. Bye-bye.